Hi, welcome to our daily encounter. Today we read the Song of Solomon, and this is a book about a relationship between a man and a woman, starting with courtship, going through marriage, then the consummation of marriage, and then the relationship from that point onward. And this is a very beautiful book, a very poetic book, and one that is masterfully written. But we shouldn't just value it because of the beauty of its content. We should also value it because of the greatness of the application that can be made to our lives. Because what we have with the Song of Solomon is not only a historical account of a relationship of Solomon with one of his wives, but we also have a picture of the love that Christ has for his church and the church has for Christ. In Ephesians chapter 5, we see that the relationship of a husband and a wife clearly pictures the relationship of Christ and his church. In Ephesians 5:31, it says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." This mystery is great, but I am speaking with reference to Christ and the church. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Song of Solomon, yes, is historical, but also, in a sense, allegorical, in that it gives us, in figurative language, the relationship of Christ and his church. And some might object to this because some of the language in the Song of Solomon is very graphic and very sexual. And they have a hard time thinking that that could be a picture of Christ's love for the church. But we got to keep in mind that when we're looking at it from the allegorical, figurative standpoint, you got to go all the way with the figure. It's not that, well, Solomon is a figure of Christ, and then this woman is a picture of the church, but then the sexual desire is literal. No, it's all, if you're going to go with the figurative, it's all going to be figurative. Even the sexual desire is just figurative of Christ's strong desire to be in communion in our lives and to have a relationship with us. And ought to be, in turn, what our desire is to walk in close communion with him and to strengthen our relationship with him. And so I don't think that this really poses a problem in looking at Song of Solomon as a picture of the love of Christ for his church and the church for Christ. With that foundation laid, I think we can then look at Song of Solomon chapter 5, starting in verse 2, where I think we have this, this story of this separation that occurs between this woman and Solomon. And it really does show a close picture of how sometimes our communion with Christ can be broken and what causes it. Now, this is what it says. It says, "I was asleep," and this is the woman speaking. It says, "I was asleep, but my heart was awake. A voice, my beloved, was knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my perfect one. For my head is drenched with dew, my locks with the damp of the night." So you have this picture of a woman who's asleep. She's just kind of in a daydream state. She's not completely asleep, but she's kind of halfway asleep. And really, our communion with Christ is broken when we start to fall asleep, when we begin to get spiritually drowsy. And the picture here is that Christ is knocking at the door. Christ is knocking at the door, asking us to open up to him. I'm reminded of the passage in the book of Revelations, in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 20, where it says, where this is Christ is speaking, it says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me." A lot of times we think this is Christ knocking on the door of the heart of the unbeliever, but no, this was Christ talking to the church. The church needed to wake up, and he was knocking at the door saying, "Look, I want to have a relationship with you. I want to come in and dine with you. And I'm knocking at the door. Just open the door and let me in." Very similar to what we find here in the Song of Solomon in chapter 5 and verse 2. And he says, my dove, my perfect one, my head is drenched with dew, my locks with the damp of the night." In other words, he's been out working, he's been out laboring while she was sleeping. And many times we as Christians, we find ourselves in that state. We are drowsy spiritually. Christ is out working, and it's no wonder we can't live in union and communion with Him, because we're not out in the field with Him working and laboring. We're on our bed asleep. Listen to her response in verse 3. I have taken off my dress. How can I put it on again? I have washed my feet. How can I dirty them again? In other words, I don't want to go outside and get dirty. I don't want to go out and go into the fields and get drenched with dew. I've already washed myself. I've already gotten undressed. I've already gotten ready for bed. And many times, perhaps this is our response when Christ calls us to labor with Him. We think, no, I've cleansed myself from sin. I've cleansed myself from the lifestyle I once lived. I don't want to go back to deal with people who have a sinful background and things like that. I've already cleansed myself. And we begin to separate ourselves from sinners, when what we ought to be doing is going right in the midst of them, bringing them the gospel message, and working with Christ and laboring with Christ to bring them into a relationship with Him as well. Then it says in verse 4, my beloved extended his hand through the opening, and my feelings were aroused for Him. I do believe sometimes Christ does touch our hearts sometimes to excite us from within, to rekindle our flame of love for Him. And this is what her beloved is doing here. He's reaching his hand through the opening, and she sees his hand, and she's excited, and she wants to be with him again. She wants to have that communion with him. And so in verse 5 it says, I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, and my fingers with liquid myrrh on the handles of the bolt. She had been living in luxury. She had her hands dipped in myrrh and her fingers in myrrh, and she was in such a luxuriant state that when her lover came to call her, she couldn't get a handle onto the bolt to open the door because of the luxuries that she had been indulging in. And I think this is a really close picture to the church in the United States. We have so much luxury. We have so many riches. Even the poorest of us are really rich compared to the other 90% of the human population. And so many times we are so distracted with those things. Even when our hearts are aroused to seek the Lord, our wealth, our possessions, the things that we desire here on earth can sometimes hinder us from opening the door to Him and enjoying His presence. And then in verse 6, she says, finally she opens it, she says, I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned away and gone. My heart went out to him as he spoke. I searched for him, but I did not find him. I called him, but he did not answer me. And so she finally is able to open the door, but by then it's too late. The moment has passed, and he has already left. And of course, she's heartbroken at this. And many times when we're so wrapped up in our worldly thinking, our worldly desires, that when Christ does arouse our hearts to seek Him, it takes us so long then to respond because of our desires, that by the time we do break loose, the moment has passed. And so this is the situation she finds herself in. In verse 7 it says, the watchmen who made the rounds in the city found me. They struck me and wounded me. The guardsmen of the walls took away my shawl from me. And so she became very vulnerable because of this broken communion, this separation that had occurred between her and her husband. And we become very, very vulnerable to spiritual affliction when we are separated from Christ. We become susceptible to temptation, to the snares and the traps of the devil. And it's a very dangerous place to be in when we allow ourselves to become separated from Christ. And then in verse 8 she says, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, as to what you will tell him, for I am lovesick. And then she goes on to describe how beautiful her beloved is, her desire to be with him again. But then in chapter 6, we see her finding out where he was. In verse 1, it says, "Where has your beloved gone, O most beautiful among women? Where has your beloved turned, that we may seek him with you? My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of balsam, to pasture his flock in the gardens and gather lilies." You see, she had discovered that he was in the garden working. He was tending to the garden, and he was pasturing the flocks. And that's where she could find him. And in our experience with Christ, if we feel a separation, if we feel like it's been a long time since we felt close to him, since we've felt his presence near us, it might be because we have not been doing the work of the Lord. When we separate ourselves from the work of the Lord, we actually separate ourselves from the Lord himself, because the Lord that we serve is a working Lord. Christ said that his Father had been working up until that point, and we continue to work, and Christ works with his Father, and if we are not working with him, how can we say that we are with him at all? We've got to go down to the garden. We've got to go down to the flocks, and we have to labor with him. Whenever we labor with him, we feel a strong tie to him, and we experience his presence with us. And so this is just a small sample of the Song of Solomon. You guys will get a chance to read, of course, the whole book. It's not very long. It is 8 chapters, but it's really not a very long read. But I wanted to bring out this one. This is kind of a good sample of the picture of Christ and his church and our relationship with Christ as pictured by this husband and wife relationship. And I guess in summary, let's just try to make sure that we are not like this woman, that we are not asleep, that we are not so much indulging in our luxuries that we cannot respond to Christ. And let's make sure that we are out laboring in the field, out tending the flock with Christ, so that we can live in close union with him. Because if we're not in close union with him, we become separated and we become very vulnerable to a lot of dangerous things. Well, I thank you guys for listening in today. Love you guys. Hope you guys have a great day. God bless.